go ahead and get started just with some basic intro before we start into the presentation. That way, if there are any late stragglers, they don't miss too much. I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Aaron Wilson. I'm the Public Works and Mobility Planning Manager, and I oversee the transportation planning for Missoula and the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization. And we have a number of other staff here. We have Ben Weiss, who's a senior transportation planner in our office, John Sands, and Deborah Postma, and Charlie Menifee, who are all transportation planners. So all of us have been working in various capacities on this project over the last year and a half or so. And we have also had some consultants helping us with this who are not here today. That's Kittleson and Associates, who's been doing the bulk of the planning and design work. Big Sky PR, who's been helping a lot with the outreach and communications. And some of you may have communicated with Christine, who is with Big Sky PR and has been doing a great job communicating with folks. And then we have DJ&A as a local engineering firm who's been providing some support locally in Missoula, and Leland Consulting Group, who did some economic analysis for us on this project. So we've got a fairly diverse team that have helped get us to the point where we're at today. Maybe just a couple of items before we get started. This is meant to be somewhat informal. Feel free to ask questions as we're going. If there's something you need clarification on or want to ask questions, we'd like to reserve most of the question and answer for the end so that we have time to get through. But if there's something specific in the presentation that you'd like clarification on, you can either put that in the chat and Ben or one of the other planners can respond, or we can flag that for follow-up as we wrap up or get through the presentation materials. And then we'll plan to have as much time as possible at the end of this to ask questions. We're all available to stay on as long as we need to have the conversation we need to have on this project. So I'd also ask maybe if you could just put in the chat, your name and what your relationship with Higgins is. That's sort of helpful for us as we get feedback, whether you own a business on Higgins, whether you use it to commute to and from downtown, or you're just using it to go to Higgins or the Hip Strip for recreation or errands. Or if you are or have a student in school near the corridor. I think that would really help us if you can just drop that in the chat as we go, and that gives us some information on who we're presenting to, and as we go through comments, helps us understand how different users of Higgins Corridor use it differently or have potentially different concerns. So with that, I think I will just jump right into the presentation and get us rolling. So as I mentioned, this is the Higgins Avenue corridor plan. I'm sure all of you are aware of that since you're here and you're interested. We're at the point in the project now where we have developed what we call the preferred concept. That's a term we use a lot in transportation that just means we've done a lot of work on analysis and public outreach, and looking at some different design concepts that we went through last fall or early, I guess it was early this spring, and pulling all of that together to say, if we're going to do a project on Higgins, this is what we think the best project is. And saying that, I want to reaffirm that we're not at the end of the project yet. We have not made a decision to say this is absolutely what we're going to do. We're at the point where we say we have decisions to make, and we can proceed with a new design for Higgins, or we can stay with what we have. And there's trade-offs associated with that. And that's largely what we're going to present today, is why we think this is what we call the preferred design for the corridor, and talk through some of the trade-offs of what that means in terms of various criteria. So it's an important step in the process. We haven't landed on a final decision yet. That will come later in the process, in the early part of 2023 as we wrap up this round of engagement. And so the input we get during this phase of the project is really critical in making that decision and trying to understand what the best direction to move forward is. So what we're going to go through today, I'll start with just an overview and review of the project goals and objectives that we set out with on this project, and talk about how that led to the design solutions that are included in the preferred concept. Talk about some of the trade-offs in that. This is a challenging corridor. There isn't room there to do everything we want to do, and so we have to decide really what's most important and how do we create the best corridor possible for all the different possible uses and goals for what we want to come out of Higgins. And then we'll wrap up with just some next steps. That's a really quick piece, just sort of what's to come after this meeting and how we're planning to move forward. So that's what we're going to cover today, and hopefully in enough time to, well, definitely enough time to give us an opportunity for question and answer. So we'll start with the project vision for this corridor, and the vision that we have for this project really came out of a number of different plans and previous work that has been done around the downtown in Missoula. First and foremost is the downtown master plan, really talked about Higgins as the core of Missoula, the backbone of our downtown corridor, and how people interact and see and experience our downtown. And that plan laid out some recommendations or direction to do some more exploration on how we could improve Higgins to support that master plan and what we're expecting to see coming in the future with downtown. We also have a long-range transportation plan that sets up large goal, bigger picture goals for the whole community and our transportation system, things like safety and multimodal connectivity and equity and making sure that we have good movement of freight and goods, sort of all of those pieces that rely on our transportation system. So using all of those things and doing some early work in this project to talk to various stakeholders about what we want to do with the corridor, we landed with a number of outcomes that we hope to achieve. One of those is a safer design for walking and biking and driving and public transportation. So regardless of how you use the corridor for transportation, that we make it as safe as possible for those users. We also want it to be an inviting streetscape. Higgins, as I mentioned, is the core of our downtown. It is as much a destination as it is a way to travel through Missoula. And so we want a design that really showcases that corridor as a destination and a gateway into downtown Missoula. We also wanted to make sure that we're promoting economic activity and that the downtown can continue to grow and that we can continue to support the businesses and people who work downtown. Or who are visiting downtown and want to get those goods and services that that makes downtown successful in Missoula. And finally, all of that kind of comes together to create what we would call Postcard Street. That's something that came out of the downtown master plan, that we want Higgins to be essentially photo worthy, that it is representative of our downtown. If it's your first experience, that it really is a place that people want to be and take photos of, maybe to post on your Instagram post or share in a postcard to friends and relatives. So all of that to say, we want to create a space, we want to create a place, we want it to be safe, and we want it to be able to support the continued growth of Missoula. The goals that we set up for this specific project that will help us achieve that vision are first and foremost the emphasis on safety. And you'll hear me say this a lot, that safety is our highest priority when we're designing transportation corridors. So we really want the corridor to be safe regardless of how you're using it. We want to increase the multimodal connections through the corridor. So regardless of what mode you're choosing to use, you have a facility or a way to get along Higgins and to those destinations. We really want to focus on business access and parking. That part of that economic growth and vitality is making sure that there is good access to those businesses and places to park or be downtown. And then thinking about downtown access as a whole. So what's our future look like in terms of people accessing downtown? And then once you are downtown, how do you stay there, whether you're parking or getting on and off the bus, providing bike parking, or as a pedestrian being able to move around. So thinking about how Higgins fits into that whole system and how we're able to continue to provide a high level of access into the downtown corridor. And again, a lot of these project goals are based in our existing plans and policies. So we have a complete streets policy in the city of Missoula that we receive direction from city council in terms of how we design our streets. We have climate goals in Missoula for both reducing our climate impacts and making sure we have a resilient system. And then we have other aspects like our economic development plans, affordable housing, all of those things influence how we look at these transportation projects and set these goals specific to an individual project. So specific to Higgins, when we think about all these different goals and what's happening there today and the issues that we are trying to solve in this corridor study, talking again first about safety, we see a number of crashes every year on the Higgins corridor. We see about 55 crashes a year. 4 of those crashes relate to bicycle riders. Somewhere around 1 pedestrian crash a year. That varies. It's a small sample size, but it fluctuates year to year. And we see 12 or more injuries every year on this corridor. And again, we're just talking about from Brooks to Broadway, just that section of Higgins. So there's a number of crashes, and it's something that we want to try to solve for and improve. And we also notice in the crash data that people biking and walking, while they're only about is that 10% of the overall crashes, they're 30% of all injuries. And so they're a particularly vulnerable user on this corridor. So when they are involved in crashes, maybe that's not as likely, or, they're not necessarily as likely to be in a crash, but they are much more likely to be injured if they are involved in a crash. Those are all things that we considered in the design of this project. We also looked at trying to address multimodal connectivity. So thinking about this corridor, not just as a way to move people through as quickly as possible, but to really make connections to the Riverfront Trail, to downtown, to the Hip Strip, to businesses. And we see a number of factors that influence that. One is the lack of left turns on the corridor is really restrictive. It serves to focus traffic as kind of a funnel that just moves people through the corridor, as opposed to being able to turn onto streets to access parking, access businesses. We have a high stress and incomplete bike network. So we do have bike lanes on the northern portion of this project corridor, but they're in the door zone of cars. They don't get maintained. It's hard to maintain them in the winter. And then once you get over the bridge, Bear Tracks Bridge, heading south, you are put essentially right out into traffic and mixing, and it creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of stress for everyone involved. And then we also have poorly defined bus stops. So some of them, like you can see in this photo here, the bus stop is essentially right at where we have 2 driveways. That's not particularly accessible or easy to find, or people don't know that it's there. And all of these things increase conflict. And when we see conflict, that leads to safety risks. It leads to higher stress for everyone, and it leads to a less efficient and less functional transportation corridor. So really thinking about the connectivity of all of the different modes and how they're getting around this corridor. And then we wanted to think about business access. So I already mentioned a little bit on the left turns is really restrictive. This is a good photo at 6th, where you're not allowed to turn left and you're not allowed to turn right, because partially it's a one-way, so you can't turn right. And we have a left turn prohibition. And so what this does is it just funnels you straight through. So if you're new to the area or trying to find a way to get access to parking, that just makes you drive around the block. It makes it hard to get to those businesses and parking spaces. And we also see a lack of business access for people who are biking, that if you're forced to go off of Higgins to get through there, then you're not going by businesses. It's harder to access them. And they're generally going to the same places that everyone else is. So there's a lot of issues. Again, this is related to the multimodal connectivity, but we see a lot of challenges with getting access on the corridor based on the way it's designed today. And then finally, just thinking about our sort of comprehensive view of how are people getting to downtown and what does the access look like. And the reality is, and this comes out of the work we do in our long range transportation plan, that if we continue to rely on single occupancy vehicle trips for the majority of our transportation needs, we quickly run out of capacity on all of our streets throughout the region. And that's true coming into downtown, crossing bridges, getting to other destinations around Missoula. And so we are really focused on this strategy of multimodal transportation. And that's true of downtown access as well, that downtown is really high density. If everyone wanted to drive downtown, we just wouldn't have anywhere to put the cars. We wouldn't have the capacity for vehicles to get there. It just would be a pretty severe limit. But if we can incentivize and make it easier to take modes like transit or walking downtown because it feels more accessible and safer, or riding a bike, then we can accommodate many more people and more trips going to downtown just by the efficiency of the overall transportation system. And that means people will continue to drive. We recognize that, and that is a reality of where we live and how we get around. But we know that there are high percentages of the population who have an interest in other modes, but it just isn't convenient or they don't feel safe. And so they're not currently taking those modes. And that leads to a less efficient system. So that leads us to what we call our preferred concept. Again, this is sort of what we winnowed down from the previous alternatives that we did. This doesn't mean this is what is going to happen. This just means this is what we think the best design is compared to what is there today. And what we included in this design, it starts with a 4 to 3 lane conversion. So that's going from 2 travel lanes in each direction with no dedicated left or right turn lanes to 2 travel lanes in each direction, but having that dedicated left turn lane to facilitate and separate out where people who are driving are going. So if you're turning left, you have a dedicated left turn arrow. We really facilitate that movement. The through lanes are just for through traffic or right turns. And so you're able to get some efficiency there in terms of just separating where vehicles are going. That design also allows, this design north of the river allows us to retain all of the parking on both sides of the street, so that we've heard many times in this, and we've seen in economic analysis, that on-street parking is a really important component of good complete street design, especially in a downtown. And then we're able to get protected bike lanes, so really physically separating cyclists from the travel lanes, which creates additional safety, it creates additional predictability, and it reduces those conflicts and maintenance challenges that we see in either mixing bike traffic or maintenance of a striped bike lane in the door zone of vehicles. South of the river, so as you go south over Bear Tracks Bridge, the design changes slightly. It's still the same general concept, but we have a little bit less right-of-way or room to work with to manage these facilities. So again, we have that same 4 to 3 lane concept that would be consistent throughout the corridor, essentially from Brooks to Broadway, and then from Broadway north to the end of Higgins. But because of that slightly narrower space, we would have to lose parking, part of the parking on just the west side of Higgins. So the blocks between 4th and 6th, we would lose all of the on-street parking. And just through some creative design, we're able to retain the parking between 3rd and 4th. So that's where Betty's Divine and Guild and Chow Mambo are all located. And then that final block between 6th and Brooks, that has some challenging parking lots and access where you have Bitterroot Floral and Electric Sound and Percussion. We would retain some of the parking. We would be able to retain some of those parking spaces. But otherwise, the design is largely consistent between the north and the south sides of the river. So moving along, so that's the general concept. These images are renderings. There's a lot of detail that we would likely, have to finesse. Don't pay too much attention to some of the specific design features. A lot of that gets ironed out in engineering. This was just a way to show more or less what it would look like in concept as you're traveling down the corridor. So I want to go through some of what we see as the benefits of this design, and then we'll talk about some of the trade-offs. The first related to 4 to 3 conversions. These are, I think there's a lot of technical analysis and design and research that has gone into what the benefits of a 4 to 3 conversion are. The first that we want to mention is that the reduction in vehicular capacity is not nearly as much as you would expect, going from 2 lanes of travel in each direction to 1. Part of that is because you're separating out the left turn movements, you're creating some efficiency there. The additional width we get, we're able to standardize our lane widths. So if you think of The section through the hip strip south of the bridge, this time of year, you really only have a lane and a half because those lanes are really narrow. The parking lanes are really narrow. We heard a lot about mirrors getting clipped and side swipes, and it's just really challenging. So we're able to standardize the lane widths. That gives some added efficiency and being able to move vehicles more smoothly. We move those left turn movements into a dedicated lane and a dedicated phase. And so you're able to move a fair amount of traffic, and these tend to work really well with the range of vehicle volumes that we see on streets like Higgins. But what really happens with a 4 to 3 lane conversion is we see a substantial increase in safety. So we see up to a 50% reduction in crashes, and that's due to not left turns. You get a protected left turn at the signals. You're not having to try to shoot a gap between 2 lanes of traffic. That often leads to a lot of crashes where people will see one car, say in the left lane, but not the car in the outside right lane because of sight distances, and then you get crashes that way. We see a lot more safety for pedestrians and cyclists. Again, just there's far fewer conflict points in this design, and so it does a lot to improve safety. We're also able to get those protected left turns that we heard a lot about were issues for people, whether they're businesses or trying to get to specific locations downtown. So you're increasing the accessibility on Higgins, in addition, rather than just thinking about Higgins as a way to shoot through and not stop. We get reduced crossing distances for pedestrians, so there's a real increase in safety and accessibility. As I mentioned, we get those improved lane widths, functions a lot smoother. We reduce some of those side conflicts of having lanes that are too narrow. And then we're able to be a little bit more creative on our maintenance and emergency access. So instead of having 2 congested lanes of traffic where you can't really get out of the way and the lanes are really narrow, we have that center left turn lane, and that's a space where emergency vehicles can use to pass through traffic. They can get through the intersections easier. And we have a place for snow storage for maintenance, and it provides a little bit more flexibility there. We can maintain those lane widths, the turns, but still have an area to store some snow in the winter, and so we get some benefits there. So that's the 4 to 3 lane conversion, and why we see there's a number of benefits with going to this particular design. Protected bike lanes in this our preferred concept, or another area where we're seeing some benefit. Particularly for separation of modes. So you're really getting people who are riding bikes away from traffic. It makes the cyclists feel more comfortable. It's more predictable for people who are driving. It's easier to maintain. There's really defined safety benefits of protected bike lanes. So the research has shown that, generally speaking, there's always exceptions, but the majority of the research shows that protected bike lanes increase safety, not just for cyclists, but for all the other users on the roadway as well. And that holds up all across the country. There are also economic benefits. So in the studies, we did some economic research. As I mentioned, Leland Consulting Group, who specializes in economic and land use analysis, did some research across the country and projects just like this, where we see 4 to 3 lane conversions with protected bike lanes. And by far, the majority of those showed a net economic benefit to the surrounding business community, or at worst, sort of a neutral. There's not really much change in the economic activity. So there's some real economic benefit. Some of that, there's a lot of research on spending behavior of different types of modes, and what that generally finds is that cyclists spend less per trip, but they take more, they have more trips in which they're spending money. So they spend more overall when compared to people who are driving. And again, that's a generality, but we see that play out all across the country. And then finally, there's increased predictability that vehicles know where cyclists are going to be. Cyclists know where cars are. There's separation. There's good separation of space between pedestrians and bicyclists and vehicles. And so everyone has a space where they know they should be, and you just get a lot more predictability that leads to safety and comfort and increased accessibility. And talking about benefits to pedestrians and safety, this design allows us to do some more improvements at the intersections that increase the visibility of pedestrians through doing these curb bulb outs. It shortens crossing distances, has a lot of safety, and just makes it more comfortable and convenient for pedestrians. Not to mention again, separating modes. When you provide a good bicycle facility, you get less people biking in the sidewalk, which reduces conflicts. So there's some real benefits for pedestrian safety and comfort that comes along with this design. Transit access, we're also able to make some improvements here. One, again, the lane widths become more of a standard. Buses are typically the widest vehicle on the street, and in the current Higgins corridor, especially when you get snow like this, it really pinches things down, and buses have a really hard time navigating that traffic when they're that narrow. So we're able to get to more of a standard transit route vehicle lane, getting better parking lanes, and just making that a smoother operation for transit. And then we're able to really highlight the transit stops along this corridor. So dealing with the locations where you see today, the bus just drops you off at a driveway, trying to combine those driveways into a single approach. It gives us more room to provide an actual bus stop and put in the amenities that you would normally see, and make transit really visible on this corridor and function a little bit smoother. And then finally, Bear Tracks Bridge. This is a question that I think there's been a lot of attention paid to, and I think a lack of good information on what this design is proposing to do and what the Bear Tracks Bridge rehabilitation project was trying to achieve. And I'll start by saying that nothing that we do in this corridor project takes away from the benefit that we get from the Bear Tracks Bridge project. That was a necessary, we had to do that project based on the condition of the bridge. We're getting an additional 25 to 50 years of life out of that bridge. That's a long time, and there will likely be a lot of change in our transportation system over that period of time. And regardless of what we do today, we're not proposing to change that overall capacity expansion that we got with this project. So we still have those wide shared use paths on each side. We have the deck width that we have. What we would propose, since you want the bridge to match up with the corridor on either side, is we think it would operate, again, smoothly with the 4 to 3 lane conversion. You would only need 2 travel lanes over the bridge. So we're able to repurpose the space to add buffered bike lanes, just going over the bridge. That separates the bicyclists from the pedestrians, but still provides a good, comfortable facility for people who are biking. It also gives us some additional space in the middle of the bridge, a hatched sort of yellowed out space that would still just be bridge deck, but that would serve as area for snow storage in the winter. So you can center plow the snow. Today, when you do that, you start to really narrow down your lane widths, and then you run into issues. We would have space to store the snow, at least temporarily, before we can come and remove it. And so there's some added benefit there. And then finally, the emergency vehicle access, we think this provides some additional space that you can move cars out of the way, potentially into that buffered bike lane space. A lot of times cars, when we have striped on street bike lanes, cars will use that space, bikes will stop, everyone sort of can move out of the way. And then you have the center of the bridge for emergency vehicle access to get through. So there's some opportunity to improve emergency vehicle access, provide snow storage. We're not getting rid of any of that deck capacity. So if things change in the future, either 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road, we still have that bridge investment that is going to serve us for the next 50 years. And we think that this design works for us today, and will continue, as we do with all transportation investments, to monitor that, and we have that investment for the future. So those are the benefits. I've talked a lot about those. Now I want to talk about some of the trade-offs that, again, we have a limited space here. We're not able to do everything in this corridor, but we think the design we have really addresses the goals that we set out for in this project in terms of safety and business access, and creating a real true complete street and a multimodal corridor that is what we would want to see in a downtown core, and would really attract people and create a place that lives up to that postcard street that we want to see. What that means, though, is that there are some changes we need to make that are not necessarily a benefit to all functions of a street. So we see, as I mentioned, we get a lot of improvement in bicycle comfort and safety. We expect, based on all of the research and analysis that we've done and projects similar to this, that we would see a benefit to economic activity, with the caveat that we would expect, there's construction impacts, and that's something we really want to focus on as we think about construction. How do we minimize those? How do we make sure that we're not creating a negative impact with construction, knowing that there's been a lot of construction on Higgins, and we know the businesses have really had to experience a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. One of the areas where we might see some real trade-off is on motor vehicle operations, particularly at the peak hour, so rush hour in the afternoon. Based on our modeling with the volumes that we see today, we would expect, if nothing changes, a total increase of about 51 seconds to get from Brooks to Broadway, or Broadway to Brooks. Again, that's just during that peak hour. That delay pretty much goes down to 0 as you get out of the peak hour. And that's assuming volumes are what they are today. And the context there is that we looked at historic trends. Volumes really haven't changed on Higgins, believe it or not, in over 20 years, that we've seen a remarkably consistent level of traffic on the Higgins Bridge over the last 20 to 30 years, even going back as far as the 70s and 80s. It's been remarkably consistent. So we think that there's been a lot of growth in and around downtown during that time, and so we think there's good reason to believe that would continue. That as the area grows, people are finding different modes, people are traveling at different times. There's just a lot of ways that you can accommodate growth and not see an increase during that peak hour of travel. If we do happen to experience increase in vehicle volumes at sort of a projected growth rate, the worst we would see is around additional 3-minute delay between Broadway and Brooks during that peak hour, if we have a projected increase in vehicle volumes. But again, all of the things that we're doing are trying to incentivize and make it easy to not have to drive. And so the research shows, and our experience in Missoula, is that when you do that, you actually do see a shift, and typically we don't see the worst outcomes of traffic analysis. And a good example of that is on 5th and 6th. So we did that. We had 2 lanes on each of those streets in one direction, one-way streets. The capacity was way over the volumes that we saw, but we had some concerns at the intersections that if we went to the one lane that we designed, that there might be some increase in congestion. Well, when we did that and we provided for the turning movements and the intersection operations to the extent possible, what we found is that that we're operating more efficiently than what the traffic modeling predicted. We're seeing higher rates of bicycle and pedestrian traffic on 5th and 6th. And overall, it's operating very smoothly today, and with a much safer design, with elimination of that 2 lanes in each direction, or 2 lanes one way on each street. So all that to say that there is a potential trade-off here. We can't accommodate ever increasing vehicular volumes and do all the other goals of this project. And so there's a trade-off there that we need to make a decision on as a community. And then finally, going through some of the others, we've talked about most of these. Motor vehicle safety, there's really good evidence that will substantially increase safety. Parking is the other one where we have some trade-offs. As I mentioned, we lose parking just on the west side of Higgins, on the south side of the bridge. Over this whole project, we estimate around 22 parking spaces that we would lose. Caveat there, not all of that is just because of our project design. Some of that is there are parking spaces that don't meet current code. So if we were to go out and stripe them today as standard parking spaces, we would have to remove them based on site distances or standard parking stall lengths, all of those factors. So some of this loss is due to just going to a standard parking design, and some of it is the potential of removing parking for those 3 blocks on the south side of the river. So there's some trade-off there. And then pedestrian comfort, there's some benefit there in terms of crossing distances and higher visibility. And then transit, where currently we don't really meet our accessibility standards. They're hard to find. They're not really what we would consider to be the best train design. Those would get better, but if we look at the potential for increased delay, that could have a small impact on transit travel times during that PM peak. But again, it's a pretty small, extra 51 seconds to a minute or two is not going to have a huge impact on overall transit operations. So those are our trade-offs that we have in this project. And so we're not saying everything is going to get better with this project, but we think the goals that we set out for, we would largely be achieving those goals with fairly minimal impacts with the preferred design. But there are differences there in terms of vehicular capacity in particular. So we've started to get some feedback. I won't spend too much time on this because this is about a 4 or 5 days old now, and we've gotten an additional 150 or so surveys since this, but the percentages have largely stayed the same. That what we're seeing in our survey is that about 70 to 75% of people would support this project or would support it with some changes, and about 25 to 30% would not or probably would not support it. So one of the things I think we're seeing is that it tends to be fairly polarizing. Hopefully what we're presenting here and the information that we have about why we're doing this project and the benefits and the trade-offs that we have can help with some of this and help make sure that everyone has the information to make the input that they would like to see. But safe to say that not everyone is 100% on board with this project, but generally speaking, there's a level of support for it. When we break it down to specific user types, that percentage generally largely stays the same, that we see a fairly high level of support for the project. One area where we're seeing more of a split is on business owners who operate along Higgins, and they have some real legit concerns. I think if I were a business owner, change is hard to predict, and I think there's some hesitancy there or worry that these changes will lead to negative impacts on businesses. But just want to reiterate, we want to have conversations with all the businesses, really understand what their concerns are and how we can allay those concerns, because the research does show that these types of projects tend to have a net economic benefit. And when I say tend to, like in almost all cases, have a neutral or a net positive. And when we see negative impacts, it typically is when all parking is removed or there's some more really substantial drastic change to the project. So not to discount those opinions, we value all of that and we want to incorporate that into our decision making. But we think there can be some good conversations around, if we move forward with this, how do we make it work? So the general feedback, that again, the themes that we're hearing, there's concern about congestion and increased congestion on the corridor. There's concern about parking loss. We've gotten several questions about parallel parking and how that would affect that through lane. And I'll just add that in relation to that potential added delay of a parallel parking car backing up traffic, what we see in the parking data is that people who are going to park drops off considerably after 4 o'clock. So between 4 and 4:30 and 5, there's far fewer people trying to park, paying for parking or trying to park on Higgins. And the delay that we typically see, the average time it takes a parallel parker is about 20 seconds. And so that delay is pretty small in the grand scheme of things. And there's more room in the corridor now, with lane widths, that we think those things can happen more efficiently. So again, we've seen some polarized opinions, but generally there's a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 support. It kind of fluctuates depending on who's submitting the survey, but that has held remarkably consistent from the beginning of this project, or beginning of this outreach, the phase and the collecting of survey responses. So just to kind of wrap up, and I know I haven't covered everything in a ton of detail, but want to have time for questions. We're going to continue engagement, that this isn't the end of it. We're going to go into the middle of January with this outreach. then going to go to the Missoula City Council and the Montana Department of Transportation sometime in January or early February with all of the analysis we've done, all of the outreach, everything we've heard from people, and try to come to a decision on where do our values and our goals land in terms of those trade-offs and what we're trying to accomplish with this corridor, knowing that we can't do it all. And then assuming that there's a positive momentum to move forward with changes, we would pursue funding and grants to try to pay for this project. So primarily looking at grant funding, that this is a project that should score really well with the current federal funding. But we want to make sure that there's support before we start pursuing those. And then finally, we would have the construction. If we get the funding, we want to do the construction. And there will be a lot to do there in terms of making sure that that construction has as small an impact on the business owners as possible through the corridor. So I've just talked a lot. Looks like I thought I saw a couple of questions come in. But maybe I'll open it up now for questions or comments. And I will stop sharing this presentation so that we can. So where do we stand? Ben, are there any questions from the chat?
Yeah, there was a question in the chat about asking if we could address the Brooks-Higgins transition. And I'm not sure if that is regarding the bike facility. I did mention, I didn't hear you talk about it, but how I mentioned that we were retaining 4 lanes between 6th and Brooks along Higgins because that's the Highway 12 section, and there's such a high volume of right turners onto Brooks if you're southbound or onto 6th Street if you're northbound, and so we're able to keep those 4 lanes there to facilitate those turns.
Yep, and I can just show you really quick what that looks like. So here, assuming you can all see this. So this is the intersection of 6th and Higgins. So this is kind of right in the middle of that Highway 12 section. And you'll see that that left turn lane becomes a through lane once you get south of 6th. So as you approach Brooks, and that's to really try to maintain that capacity. That's where we see the highest volumes is along the Highway 12 section. So making sure that we maintain that vehicle capacity. Same for people coming from Brooks to 6th. We see a lot of traffic that's going from Brooks onto Higgins for a block and then turning onto 6th. And so we want to maintain that vehicle flow. And what that means at the intersection is that we would have to really pay attention to safety where you have those right turning conflicts. So at Brooks, you would get a dedicated bicycle signal where that right turn is either prohibited or yielding to the crossing pedestrian and bike traffic. And then when you have that right turn get a dedicated arrow, you would be stopping pedestrian and bike traffic. So at that intersection, here really trying to focus on, again, predictability and preventing those conflicting movements to the extent possible. And same as you get up to 6th, having either a dedicated bike phase for this signal or a leading, what we call a leading interval. So the bikes and pedestrians get the green just before vehicles do. So you're out ahead of that right turning traffic. And just the way we can design these intersections, you increase the visibility to make sure that that's safe. So we're trying to retain the capacity, accommodate those right turning movements, but make it safe for all of the users is what we're attempting to do with this design. Any other questions from folks who are on the meeting, not in the chat?
John Wolverton, it's more of a statement than a question, but mentioned that this is happening also alongside a potential front main two-way restoration project. How are we incorporating or considering that?
Yeah, we've been coordinating with the front main project all along. So we've been using the same traffic analysis. We are developing designs that would accommodate both the front main two-way conversion and the Higgins project. At some point, ideally these projects get constructed at the same time. So we're only doing that impact of construction once. But we want to get the intersections right. The intersections are really where it matters. And in some ways, our preferred concept works really well with the front main two-way conversion because you get those left turns now that would help just with general circulation. And we can integrate the two designs so that those intersections work safely. Feel free, folks can raise their hand or just jump in if you want to ask a question, not in the chat, or just offer your thoughts and ideas, whether you love it, you hate it, somewhere in between.
Hey, Aaron, could you show the intersection at 5th and really talk about those bus stops a little bit more? There was a question about the inbound bus stop between Brooks and the bridge.
Yeah, so the bus stops here at 5th, there's a little bit of design that we had to, it's a little bit tricky because again, we're pretty limited in space. So right here in front of Melamood, where you have currently 2 driveways coming out onto Higgins and the bus just drops you off, we'd be proposing to combine those driveways, make it a little bit more space efficient, but also provide space for the bus stop. But what we don't have is enough room here to have a bus stop and the protected bike lane and the making all of that fit. And so what we're proposing for both of these bus stops is that the bus would pull into the bike lane temporarily for the bus stop. And while that creates a little bit of conflict with the cyclists where they may have to wait for the bus to pick up and board passengers or go into traffic or go onto the sidewalk to get around, you still maintain that separated space. And we're also able to accommodate turning trucks. So when you think about trucks turning from 5th onto Higgins, which is part of that Highway 12 route, the bigger trucks really have a hard time making sharp turns. And so by pushing the protected bike lane up a ways, you allow trucks to overtrack into that bike lane when they're making that turn. And so we can accommodate them. Again, there's not that many trucks that make that movement, but they do happen. But luckily they wouldn't happen while you would expect to have a cyclist there, because the protected bike, the north-south bike route, would have a red light when the trucks are making that movement. So we would expect it to be clear. So that's kind of how we're proposing to do the bus stops on the south side of the river. It's sort of a shared space between buses and bikes. But again, bus service at 15 minutes, which would be the most frequent we would likely to see here, is not really often enough in our mind to create a huge conflict. And it uses space fairly efficiently in the corridor. So hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to, if I didn't get it completely.
Aaron, there's another question about planning at Broadway. Does it allow for pedestrian safety islands in the center of Broadway at all, where people are, that's the kind of remaining double threat? And so does this plan address that at all?
No, because we still we're not really changing Broadway configuration. So Broadway will still remain 4 lanes, but what we are doing is proposing some bulb outs, and the exact design of these is it will likely change as we go through engineering and really look at all of the specific details. But we think we can at least get some curb bulb outs, do more of a traditional protected intersection that then increases visibility of pedestrians and shortens that crossing distance across Higgins, and could shorten it slightly across Broadway as well. So we're providing a better intersection and safety in terms of visibility. You would have your protected left turn still from Higgins that prevent that left turn conflict, and shorter distances.
Aaron, can you go back to Brooks Higgins and discuss that southbound bike movement once more?
Yeah, so if you can see this, so here's the protected bike lane as you're going south and approaching Brooks. As you come to the intersection, that we would have a dedicated bicycle signal here. So as a cyclist, when that's red, you would stop. Then, especially when that right turning movement is really being allowed. And so then when you get the green arrow so this would either be triggered by bicyclists or you'd have a push button or something. So when you get that green signal for bikes, you would allow straight moving traffic on Higgins, but that right turn lane would have either a red arrow or a yield sign so that they're yielding to bikes and pedestrians while they have the green. And then that would switch back to red, which would then stop pedestrians and bicyclists and then allow that right turn again. Does that describe it well? And the other nice thing is that we've got these curb bulb outs and you're just a little bit further ahead, so there should be really good visibility that cars as they're coming up to that intersection should really be able to see the people on bikes well.
We got a thank you for that clarification, so I think that you answered the question.
Sure, no problem.
A comment that as we get to designing that Broadway intersection to try and make sure that we don't preclude potential changes to Broadway, such as a 4 to 3 in the future.
Yep. Absolutely.
There have been several comments of thanks for consideration of safety and prioritizing that. Thank you for increased safety, usable bike lanes, and full-time left turn access for cars. And thank you for considering all modes. Another comment here, let's separate the grades between the sidewalks and the bikeways to address pedestrians wandering onto and along bikeways. Street furniture doesn't always work well. Yeah. Again, those are the kind of technical details that what if this gets approved and then we are successful in finding funding for it, those are the sorts of details that will come out in that level of engineering. But right now, it's a good comment that we'll keep in the full project folder. But we're not at a place to determine that.
Yeah, this is really at a conceptual stage, so there's a lot of work that would have to happen to really get the engineering down. There's stormwater, there's precise grading of all these facilities that we would try to get through as much as possible. We're coming up on 1 o'clock, and we had wanted to try to keep this at an hour. Any other thoughts or input and reactions? I would encourage everyone to go take the survey if you haven't already. That's really helpful for us, and provide as much comment as you want, or you can send us emails as well. And John, for left turning bikes, yes, we would, some cyclists could get out into the, you could get into the left turn lane, or we would propose doing the two-stage left turns for cyclists using bike boxes, which is pretty standard for protected bike lanes. So, depending on your level of comfort in mixing with traffic, you could either merge into traffic in the left turn lane, or you could go to the intersection and do a two-stage left. And that's largely what happens north of Broadway. You can use the alley sometimes, or just merge into traffic in the block before and then into the left turn lane. Or you could do the two-stage left, but we would be intentionally trying to design in a way that there's clear places where you would do that two-stage left turn.
That's another trade-off, is that the experienced fearless cyclist that is used to kind of getting out and making left turn, veering across lanes and making left turns with traffic, that might be a little bit harder. They might have to go a little slower. They might have to wait a phase and make that left turn in 2 stages. And in return, we're intending to create facilities that are more comfortable for people of all ages and abilities. We see repeatedly in surveys that more than half the city's population wants to ride a bike more for transportation, but doesn't feel comfortable doing it. And so we really believe that projects like this will help encourage more of those folks to ride more frequently. Emily Jensen has asked if we can use planters for the separation on the bridge with low maintenance greenery. I think that's possible, and again, that'll be something that we look at when we get to the engineering phase. Although a caveat there is that what we're seeing nationally is that a lot of those bike lane planters are getting pulled by cities, that they're not functioning as intended, and are creating hazards that were unanticipated. So it's something that we'll continue to look at and would certainly evaluate when project time comes. But A, I don't know if there's width, and B, I don't know if there's what the state of the practice will be when we actually come time to engineer for this. Then there's a question for where is MDT support on this proposal? Aaron, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we've been having lots of good conversations with the state. This is the State Department of Transportation's route. I think we're in a good place. What MDT is really interested in seeing are a couple of things. One, that this configuration can continue to function, and that we're not creating too many, that we're not really creating just hazardous or really terrible congestion issues. We think we've addressed that in our traffic analysis, that there's a little bit of trade-off there, but it's not a huge difference today. And then the state also wants to know that there's community support for this, that they're wanting to work with local communities to achieve our goals. There are some caveats to that. We have Highway 12, that there's federal performance measures that we have to maintain for that. So I think that goes into the analysis piece of it. But by and large, I think if there's community support to do this, and a willingness to accept those trade-offs, that I think the state is willing to keep going on this project and support us in moving forward with it. Again, there are a lot of details in the design that we have to get right, and we'll have to continue to work on it. But I think we've been working really well together and partnering on this project, and trying to come up with a solution that works for them and their goals for the highway system, and locally as a community. So I think we've had good conversations, and I feel pretty positive about moving forward, regardless of which direction we go on this project with the state. Any other closing thoughts from folks? We've heard from a number of you, but those who are on and haven't chimed in yet, feel free to unmute if you want and chime in, or throw it in the chat. Or if we're good, we can wrap up. Maybe let's give it a minute or so and continue to be on. But let us know if you have any additional comments or questions or final thoughts. Right. Well, if not, I guess we'll wrap things up here, and feel free again to reach out to us. Charlie put his contact info in the chat. But reach out to any of us via email, the survey, the project website, and let us know. Let us know how you feel about the project. This is sort of a really important stage for us to hear from as many people as possible, one way or another, whether you support it or not. Really is helpful in making sure that we're making the right decisions, given the challenging trade-offs and decisions we have to make. So yeah, I guess thanks everyone for coming, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.